One thing that I have never understood, and to this very day do not, is that the remote viewing, when we saw Ted Koppel, it was to announce we had been doing it for 20 years, but guess what? We're not doing it anymore because it doesn't work. Well, 20 years is a hell of a long time to decide something doesn't work.
Oh, dear. The best way to make people not be concerned is to say it doesn't work. You know, it's the same thing as like saying UFOs don't exist and ETs aren't real.
That's right.
And so, you know, you can put out this social conditioning out there that simply causes people not to think about it because it's thought to be insignificant even if it does exist.
And so over those 20 years, they developed a method that has become to be known as CRV, Controlled Remote Viewing, whereby literally any person on the planet can learn this method and become a psychic spy. And even though I'd looked at many over 30 years, oh gosh, I can't even count how many alien things, this thing affected me because it's in the here and it's in the now, and it had a message for today. And so it was shocking to me, and I had a really visceral reaction. I ended up crying, and I think part 2 of it was like one session over 3 days because of this connection to this source, whatever it is. So it was so unlike us and so unlike anything I had ever remote viewed before. It was otherworldly, and it made me realize that, you know what, this is real, this is here, this is now, everything's changing in this moment.
Welcome everyone to Cosmic Convergence, an experiencer-hosted podcast. I'm joined with my fellow co-hosts, John and Christian. Today, we have Birdie Jaworski and one of the world's most prominent remote viewers who have come back after 22 years of being away from the public. Birdie developed the remote viewing technique of TransDimensional Mapping, and she has worked in the private sector using her skill. She's recently remote viewed the New Jersey drones and activity all over the U.S., and she has showed her findings. Today, we're going to go a little bit more deeper and learn about Birdie. So Birdie, thank you so much again for being on the show with us.
Thank you so much for having me on here, guys.
So Birdie, wanted to start off with, can you tell us, for any new listeners on the show, what remote viewing is and your background in it?
Yeah, so in 1995, the government declassified the Stargate program. It was all over the news at that point. And these military guys came out in the news and explained that they had been trained by the US military to be psychic spies. And what had happened was the government had learned that Russia was doing all of this research into parapsychology, and they were concerned that the Russians were going to get the upper hand. So they spent over $20 million of taxpayer money in 20 years to figure out how they could train their own soldiers to be psychic spies so that they could spy on the enemy, find out what the adversaries are doing behind enemy lines without having to put any soldiers in danger. And they gathered a bunch of researchers, scientists that have been doing work in parapsychology, such as Hal Puthoff, and a number of natural psychics who are extremely well known, the most prominent of which is Ingo Swann.
In considering perception, you have to understand that it can be closed down. You know, I mean, there are all sorts of processes that can be used to limit a person's perceptual faculties. So if they can be closed down, such as in hypnosis and brainwashing and all kinds of social programming and things like that, these things can be reduced from their functioning. If they can be reduced from their functioning, they can also be expanded. And that was the principles that we went forward with, was perceptual studies.
In other words, how far could you take it?
Yeah.
Apparently far enough to get funding to go for 20 years now.
Yes.
We were all shocked.
You had to produce results, though, really fast, so it wasn't just merely a hypothesis. You had to put your results where your mouth was eventually.
Well, you did that, right? Or it was done.
It was done, yes.
It was done. One thing that I have never understood, and to this very day do not, is that the remote viewing, when we saw Ted Koppel, it was to announce we had been doing it for 20 years, but guess what? We're not doing it anymore because it doesn't work. Well, 20 years is a hell of a long time to decide something doesn't work.
Oh, dear. Actually, when you think of the larger societal picture and the balance of powers and the secrecy that goes on with everything, you know, would you want to have high-quality remote viewing admitted as workable?
No.
No. No. I was told behind the scenes as early as 1973 that even if I was told in secret or in confidentiality, that even if we did succeed at demonstrating something along these lines at Stanford, that eventually it would be obliterated because if something like that becomes good enough, then it's a threat potential against everybody's closely guarded secrets.
And so over those 20 years, they developed a method that has become to be known as CRV, controlled remote viewing, whereby literally any person on the planet can learn this method and become a psychic spy. This was declassified in 1995. And once it was declassified, I learned about it. I was watching a news program and there was one of these military guys saying, and you can learn this too. And I thought, good Lord, I've got to learn this. And it just happened to be that I was living in Atlanta, Georgia at the time. And there was a sociology professor at Emory University, Dr. Courtney Brown, who was just starting a school to teach people these techniques. He had been trained by one of the military members, and he was just about to open this school, which he called the Farsight Institute. And the Institute didn't have a website. And I didn't have the $3,000 that he was charging for training. So we swapped and I built the website and I got the training. So I became a psychic spy in 1995, end of 1995. And since then, I worked my way up the ladder, became the vice president at Farsight the next year. And a couple of years later, I left to start my own company, TransDimensional Systems. This was, 1998, around there. And what I did at that point was I changed the military method, the military protocol for remote viewing because it was very militaristic. Of course it was. It was designed for soldiers. And so the language and the intent behind it, I felt that these things should be changed and shifted in a way to make it more accessible to the public and especially women, because it was a very patriarchal kind of system. So I developed my own system of remote viewing based on CRV, which people have come to call TDRV, transdimensional remote viewing. I didn't call it that at the time, but since then, people call it that and still are learning my method. There are a number of trainers out there who are teaching my old method. I'm not even sure who these people are, but they're teaching my old method. And anyway, so I worked, managing about 200 remote viewers in my group. I trained thousands across the world. And I eventually left the company and just shut everything down because I was being severely harassed by who knows who. I think it was kind of black ops, government adjacent organizations. And it wasn't just me, it was other members of my organization. We were being followed by white vans with the windows blacked out. We were getting threatening phone calls. They were threatening myself with death, threatening my children who were young at the time. They're all grown up now. And I decided it wasn't worth it to me. So I left the public field and became a private individual. But I still worked on remote viewing. In fact, I kind of dived into it deeper at that point because I really wanted to figure out what's going on when you remote view. How can I get more data that's directly relevant? How can I actually use just the power of my mind to describe something with as much accuracy as possible? And over the past 22 years, I developed a system I now call TransDimensional Mapping, which is a form of remote viewing. And a few months ago, I was outed. I didn't plan to come back into the public, but somebody discovered where I was because I had changed my name. My name back in the day was Prudence Calabrese, and now I go by Birdie Jaworski. And so I was outed. And so I decided to jump back in and to start teaching people my new method. And I've taught a handful of classes. I'm teaching one more class in January, and then I'm not teaching again. But I'm going to be working on operational work. I've been developing a group of remote viewers over the past few months, and we are already getting requests from law enforcement, different companies, all kinds of individuals who have questions that they want answered.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for giving us those details, Birdie. One of my other following questions with that was, what is the difference between the technique you've developed and CRV? Like, what are the pros and cons to each of them? Besides the fact that it's militarized, can you give a little bit more description on the differences for people who are not aware of it?
Yeah, so in CRV and in mapping, you start with something called an ideogram. So in all of remote viewing, no matter what you call it, remote viewing, transdimensional mapping, you're doing this blind, meaning you don't know what it is you're looking at. Somebody else knows what it is, and they tell you, hey, I've got something for you to remote view. And you do your remote viewing, and then you find out after the fact. And that is true in what I do. And it's true for the military method, CRV, which stands for controlled remote viewing. It also stands for coordinate remote viewing, because originally, back in the military program, they were giving the soldiers literal coordinates, the latitude and longitude of particular places that they wanted these soldiers to go to. They would give them those numbers, the latitude and longitude, and the soldiers' minds would then perceive what was happening behind enemy lines, wherever it was in the world. But they soon discovered that the numbers really were kind of inconsequential. And the other reason they needed to figure out something different was because sometimes they might have wondered what happened in the past or what's going to happen in the future. And if you give just a raw coordinate, actual coordinate number, you're going to get what's happening right now. There's no way to move backward and forward in time unless the remote viewer thinks about moving forward and backward in time. So they discovered that random numbers work just as well. So in all of remote viewing, this is kind of standard in like all of the, whether it's CRV, SRV, which is the Farsight Institute's version, scientific remote viewing, or Ed Dames' version, Major Ed Dames, one of the military remote viewers, he came up with TRV, technical remote viewing. There's a million blank RVs out there, quite frankly, and they're all derivatives of the CRV system. But they all start with the same thing, what's called an ideogram. And this comes from Ingo Swann. And it's kind of a way that you can get an initial impression about what's happening here. Now, if I asked any of you gentlemen to draw water that fast, like half a second, draw water, boom, you would draw a wavy line. I wouldn't even have to look at your paper to know that's what you would draw. If I asked you to draw a mountain, boom, that fast, you'd draw something that rises and falls. Maybe it would have a peak, maybe it would be rounded, but it would look mountain shaped. We have this internal knowledge, this internal language, this way that we order the world, and we understand these basic, what they call gestalts. So you start with an ideogram, and that's true in CRV, and I use those in my own method. Now, in CRV, the way that a remote viewing session progresses is you get your ideogram, you do a quick doodle, and that tells you something about what's there, and you probe it with your pen, which means you literally press your pen into the paper and you immediately write down the first sensory impressions that you get. Now, this system was developed to keep your left hemisphere of your brain occupied. Now, the left hemisphere of your brain is that part of your brain that's controlling, it wants answers, it wants to know what's going on, and it can be kind of problematic if you're trying to get intuitive information because that comes out of the right side of your brain, your more creative side. So you keep your mind busy with the left brain by writing down all this nonsense so that the right side of your brain can give you this intuitive information. That's the psychic information. So in CRV, you probe the ideogram, you write down some impressions, you might do a quick sketch, And then you move on to a section that they call the matrix. The matrix in CRV and in all of its derivatives is a piece of paper, and you divide it into columns. You draw columns in rows, and you label each column with an initial that stands for a type of data that you might receive. Like, so the first column might have an S at the top to stand for sensory information. The next column might have an M to stand for magnitudes, meaning how tall or short or thin or wide something is, how vast or small it is. And then you might have a column for energy or structures, blah, blah, blah. So you end up with a matrix, and each of the derivatives of CRV has different matrix settings, but it's essentially the same thing. And what you would do is probe in each column of this matrix going right across. You get a piece of sensory data, then you'd get a magnitude, then you'd get a physical thing, then you might get something related to energy. And so you end up at the end of the session with a lot of disconnected data. Now, all the data would be relevant to what's at your so called target, but you would have a hard time at the end being able to tell somebody what this actually is. It doesn't give you an opportunity to develop a narrative or to figure out the relationship between things. So when I left the public field, I thought about it for a long time. And for, I don't know, a few years, I just did regular remote viewing sessions, TDRV, which is what people call it today, which is a derivative of CRV. I had a matrix, and I was not satisfied with that. I wanted to be able to be more creative and to be able to use my body more and to think about things and to be able to actually know what's happening. I didn't care if I drew something and it looked like the target at the end. I didn't care. I wanted to actually experience and know, to have a deeper experience. So I developed the system I call mapping. And you use a huge piece of paper, and you get to use all kinds of colors and textures. So crayons and markers and colored pencils. And so you start with an ideogram, you start getting basic impressions, and then you start sketching things out on a large scale piece of paper using whatever colors and textures seem intuitive to you. And this is super enlightening. Then you can draw lines between things and figure out the relationship. And if you in CRV, if you have a conclusion or an idea, you think you know what it is, you're supposed to discard it off to the side. They call that an analytic overlay. But in mapping, you work with those conclusions and you deconstruct them in the middle of your session. You say, okay, I think this is Disneyland. And so you write down Disneyland, and then you ask yourself, why? Why do you think it's Disneyland? And you then begin to realize, oh, I think it's Disneyland because there's a lot of kids here and it smells like fair food. And that's your real data. So mapping is a way to actually access kind of all of that data and be able to put it into a larger framework. And it's been extraordinarily successful for me. And all of the students that I've worked with in the past few months since I came back on the scene love it, love it. Even those who have been highly trained in all of these different other methods of remote viewing, CRV and its derivatives, they're like, they're never going back because this allows you to really see something cool. I mean, for example, one of my students, in training, like on day 2, I gave them, it was a photograph, and it was the filming of The Wizard of Oz, the original filming of The Wizard of Oz, a photograph of Dorothy in her outfit and some little munchkins and the filmmakers there. And my mapper, my remote viewer, my student, she draws a little girl, and then she grabs a yellow crayon and draws this trail. And of course, it's the yellow brick road. So colors and textures tell you so much about what's happening. And she was able to develop this whole thing that told the whole story of Dorothy. She knew Dorothy was on a journey, that she met some friends, that they were going to a castle to see a wizard. She literally got all of that data. And all of my students are amazing like that. So that's what I do.
Wow. And it's like, I kind of, after watching your transdimensional mapping and watching you draw things out on that, what's the size of the canvas that you use, like in the examples in the background?
Oh, it's pretty big. It's like
Yeah.
2 feet by 3 feet. I use really huge pieces of paper. I also have a super large tablet, digital tablet that sometimes I use, but I prefer paper because I like the physical sensation. I use my hands a lot, which people will see if they watch me doing this.
And that's the amazing part, because yeah, I grew up. My mom was an artist, and so I grew up as an artist. And no, one doesn't have to be a Picasso or Michelangelo or anything like that when doing this method. But what I love about it is, as well as I'm watching you view, that a lot of times you're rubbing your hand over the image that you drew, and that's very tactile, and I just love that. So as an artist, I look at going to art galleries, not just my own work, but going to art galleries, and when there's texture onto a painting, and if you're feeling that painting, which you shouldn't do in art galleries, but we'll just say if you're feeling that painting, then it's taken to the perspective of what the artist may have been feeling when making that painting, which in a way is remote viewing, right? You're getting the
Exactly.
Yeah. And so when I started watching, I was just enthralled, and it hit me, of course, in a spot because of my artist background. And then in the background that I'm getting into now, that has been pervasive throughout my entire life, that connection. And so that's what I just think is absolutely beautiful about the work that you do, not just the answers that you get, but just that whole tactile experience and the senses and amplifying it. So, I mean,
Yeah,
I
it's
suggest
amazing.
it
And the
is.
other thing too is, and I think this is important for all of your watchers and listeners to understand, is you do not have to be a good artist. I am a terrible artist. Just look at my stuff. It's all stick figures, basic structure looking things, but I still can feel it. I can still feel it rise off the page. I mean, I've never been a good artist, but one thing that I've discovered is that remote viewers generally can be put into three different categories. This is something I kind of developed over the past 25 years. Some remote viewers are very visual. And if you go online and you look up amazing remote viewing results, you're going to find results by visual remote viewers. These are the people that are the good artists, and they're going to draw something that looks just like that picture that they're trying to remote view. But they might not understand really what's going on. And then you have emotional remote viewers. These are the people that connect deeply to the people or the animals or the beings, if it's non-human, or spirits or whatever, or the emotions of a place, such as like some of the Civil War battlegrounds or a concentration camp. Even today, those places hold all kinds of emotion, and emotional remote viewers connect to that. And the third kind, which is what I am, is a conceptual remote viewer. And conceptual remote viewers, they write a whole lot of language because they understand what is happening, and they're able to describe who is there, the who, what, when, where, why of what's happening, even though their sketches may not be the best. So, and it really takes all three to do a big project. So it's kind of nice to work in a group because you get these different perspectives, and then you can fully understand what's happening.
Well, I just might want to add that, while you say you're not a good artist, and I do notice that a lot of times you're like, I can't spell when I'm doing this, which also is not important. I would personally love some prints of your stuff because it's just amazing. It is artwork. And again, it hits on a deep note. At least for me, it does. And I'm sure that's for a lot of people too. So yeah, I put some online. I'll purchase them. By the way, the sign next to you is also available, but maybe we'll cover that later. Kristen, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a statement and a question. Just thank you for being here, Birdie, taking the time. And I know that there are differences between mediumship and remote viewing. However, based on a lot of your descriptions, they resonate with me deeply because there's also different kinds of mediums as well that describe kind of like how it works for them, sort of like how that remote viewing works, especially like for me. I am very visual also. So I didn't even know until recently that there are some people that can't picture images in their mind, which is crazy. They're like, I know what an apple is, but I can't see an apple in my mind, which I thought everyone could see an apple in their head, you know? So there's that, and I also get I forgot what it's called, if it's cognizance or something like that, but I'm also a feeler. So like if I was interacting with a spirit, hypothetically, I feel what they mean. I don't know how to describe that. So it's just like that intention, feeling, the emotion, so I want to try remote viewing just because like that I'm familiar with. So that's awesome. But my question would be based on, and I know this depends on your data that you've been getting, but I know you've been doing this for a long time. With this increase of awareness and all this stuff going on, drones, UFOs showing up, have you gotten a sense or an idea or even an opinion on what you think is happening, whether that be government or NHI or both?
Yeah, Christian. Okay, I want to point up two things and then I'm going to answer your question.
Sure.
Just based on what you said. First of all, mediumship, people who do all kinds of really beautiful intuitive work, whatever kinds of psychic work it may be, or healing work like Reiki, or if they work with tarot cards, all of these things are on a continuum along with remote viewing. They are all related. We are all accessing the same kind of information point, and we're using these different tools to access the same kind of information. And so I think all of these arts are incredibly beautiful and important, and that people should find which one of these kinds of things resonates with them. And the other thing I was going to point out, I think Jonathan was mentioning me saying, "Oh, I can't spell that." That is a clear sign you're doing a good job remote viewing, because it means your left brain has shut the heck down, because it's your left brain that can spell. Your right brain doesn't know how to spell. So all the time in my sessions, you'll hear me say, "I can't spell this. I can't spell this." Because I am so clued in. My left brain has just shut the heck up. But as to what's going on, I think that we're at a really interesting point. In 2017, the kind of this slow disclosure started to happen. And I would argue that slow disclosure has been going on for decades through our media, through our entertainment systems, all these movies, things like Close Encounters, X Files, all these different kinds of things have been getting out the truth little by little. But in 2017, it started in earnest. And it's so interesting if you look back and look at what's happened in the past 7 years. At that time, the New York Times came out with that incredible article by Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal and others about how the government had a secret program that was investigating UFOs. They named Lou Elizondo for the first time, who had just come out as a public person. And they also shared images in the paper and then the videos online of the Tic Tac UFO, the Go Fast and the Gimbal. And that was really the beginning of our modern disclosure movement. It's been fascinating to watch. Since then, all kinds of things have snowballed, and we have all kinds of new whistleblowers coming out, David Grush and others. And we have these incredible moments with our Congress people and here in the United States. Members of the House and the Senate are coming out publicly and saying that the public has a right to know. They're talking about being stonewalled. They're holding hearings. So we have this incredible disclosure movement that's been happening, which I truly believe has been by design.
Mhm.
And right now we are at this amazing crossroads for all of humanity, where we are becoming a more technologically based species. We are developing artificial intelligence, and we're kind of giving over a little bit of our humanity to these things. And so we're at a crossroads where we need to decide who we want to be. At the same time, we are in this horrible kind of conflict with ourselves and with each other. We have a chance of nuclear war happening. Look at what's happening with Ukraine and Russia and Putin's posturing, and NATO, the United States. Everybody has been involved. There's been nuclear weapons being moved from here to there, and there's a real sense of dread. So we're at this amazing crossroads with technology and with fear mongering, warmongering, and who are we going to be going forward? Who are we going to be? And at this moment in time, while we're trying to figure these things out, all of a sudden, all these things start appearing. And it's actually been happening, I think, over the past few years. But it's just coming to the forefront because of all the activity in New Jersey. New Jersey is the most highly densely populated state in the country. And they're seeing all of these incredible things in the sky. Now, the buzzword that they're using is drones. It's drones out there. And that's kind of a way to keep the public from being afraid, I think. And
It's my
also,
theory.
yeah, exactly. And it's also a way for the government to keep a lid on what's actually happening. But if you look at the descriptions and you listen to some of these interviews with these different mayors, these different townspeople, and all these locations in New Jersey, what they're seeing is not conventional drones. It's not even secret project drones, because these things are morphing from shape to shape. They're orbs that become something that looks like a drone or looks like an
Hmm.
airplane or a helicopter. They're going in and out of the ocean. They're flying low over people's homes, which a secret project certainly wouldn't do. There's plenty of testing grounds around. And if this were some kind of a operation, it wouldn't be unfolding the way it is. And the other thing that's been happening is it's not just happening over New Jersey. It has spread out. It's being seen in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, even over the capital. It's been seen in Texas, Colorado, on the West Coast. It's amazing. It's just spreading out and spreading out. And what I think is happening is this is a sign that we need to wake up. I think this is a true non-human intelligence that is starting to arise and to try to give us a signal that we're not alone and that we need to truly evaluate who we are as a species right now. Now, of course, there are some military things in the sky because they're monitoring what's happening. Obviously, we got your military drones up there and helicopters and airplanes and whatnot, trying to make sense of this, but they haven't been able to stop it. And I think they're terrified. That's why the government has given us so many competing narratives over the past few weeks. It's been insane. First of all, they said, oh, nothing to see here. And then it's like, oh, we don't know what's going on, but it's not adversarial. And now, then they move to, oh, it's just hobbyist drones. That when the national security guy said, oh, yeah, anyone can buy these at a convenience store. It's like, yeah, I can go to 7-Eleven and buy one of these things. I don't think so. An SUV sized drone. So
It
I
makes me
think.
feel like they know something too, because why wouldn't you do anything? Because there have been cases of drones being taken down because they know that that's what it is, and they're like, but you have people asking them directly, like, why aren't you, this is a no-fly zone, and you would, if it was anything else or anything conventional, you would take action immediately. We had a balloon over here in North Carolina, and you took action like almost immediately. But then this, they're like, we're not going to shoot them down. And the excuses that they're coming out with are just, total BS. Like, and my favorite part is that people are like, oh, this is an American thing. This is just happening over America, even though we've had interactions with people from Canada, Australia, and they've had their own footage of things flying around, and they're not drones. But I'm glad you brought that up, especially the transforming aspect, because we're discussing that and shared some of those videos of them doing just that. Even our guest and friend Jeff Silver in Canada was showing like clear footage of something that looked like a drone, and he was talking about how it would transform. It went from blinking lights to a solid light to something that looked like a hockey puck flying clear view outside on his balcony, and you can see like the mountains, the mountain range that he had. So clearly, there is a difference. And again, I agree with you. I don't think all of them are. There are like our own stuff up there, and who's to say we don't have any secret stuff up there that gets confused between like UFO? But there are definitely like true. I like UFO. I don't know, old school, true UFOs flying around amidst the conventional technologies that we may not know.
Before we go into the New Jersey drones and what you've come across, Birdie, in your whole history of remote viewing and doing everything that you do, what's been the strangest thing you've come across in non-human intelligence or UFO, ET aspect that kind of shook you or really made you reposition yourself on the subject?
That's a great question. And I have so many answers to that. I think the first thing that really shook me isn't anything non-human. Well, it is non-human. Is when people always ask me, what is your favorite thing you've ever remote viewed? I always answer this because it changed my perspective on literally everything. When I first got into remote viewing, and this is like almost 30 years ago, my dad was afraid that I was getting into a cult. I mean, and I get it. I get it. This is weird stuff. And especially 30 years ago, this was really strange. And he was afraid that I was getting involved in something I shouldn't get involved in. And I said, "Okay, Dad, well, test me. Test me. Let's see if it's real. Give me something to remote view." And he wrote something down, and gave me the random numbers, and I did a session on it. And what he had given me, which I didn't know while I was doing the session, was a rock, just a rock that was sitting on his desk, a paperweight. He used it as a paperweight. He had gotten it on a hike that we had taken, when I was a little kid. And that rock has been sitting there for years, and he gave me that rock to remote view. Now, anyone out there who's a remote viewer knows how hard that is to remote view. It's usually way easier to remote view something that has a strong emotional or energetic component. And just a rock sitting on a desk, hey, that's a tough ask. But I started drawing it, and I first thought maybe it's a mountain. Then I'm like, no, it's not a mountain. And I figured out, oh, it's a huge boulder. I thought it was huge. And then I realized it was some kind of a rock. But what was so fascinating to me is during this session, I had this communication with this rock. It wasn't like you and I communicating or communicating with any other kind of being, even a dog. It was so different. This rock had consciousness, and I could feel it from its whole living existence, from the time it was formed in the great primeval whatnot, and how it, ended up rolling, moving around, breaking off from whatever it was originally, becoming a rock that my dad picked up, put on his desk, to its inevitable end when our son finally, explodes or whatever our son's going to do. And so I had this intense, intense connection with this completely inanimate object, this rock. And from that moment on, I started to look at everything differently, because that rock absolutely was a conscious being. It wasn't like human consciousness, but it was consciousness after all. And so that was the first really surprising session that I've done. And I was looking at alien stuff before that, but that surprised me even more. And I'd also have to say that these drone sessions that I did were extraordinarily surprising, and even gave me a sense of, they throw this word around a lot, ontological shock, but it really was an ontological shock for me, because it's one thing to think that something exists, to think that aliens exist and to believe that aliens exist. And it's another thing to know it and to sense it and to have it in front of you. And even though I'd looked at many, many, many over 30 years, oh gosh, I can't even count how many alien things, this thing affected me because it's in the here and it's in the now, and it had a message for today. And so it was shocking to me, and I had a really visceral reaction. I ended up crying, and I think part 2 of it was like one session over 3 days. And I think on the second part, I was crying because of this connection to this source, whatever it is. So it was so unlike us and so unlike anything I had ever remote viewed before.
So beautiful. Cry. I'm super weepy. It's really beautiful. The collection is important for later. Okay, collection's important. Why? It's safety mechanism. It's a way to remember.
It was otherworldly, and it made me realize that, you know what? This is real. This is here. This is now. Everything's changing in this moment. And so I would have to say that those two sessions were two of some of the most amazing sessions I've ever had. And I've had a lot of amazing sessions. I've seen all kinds of stuff.
I just wanted to say briefly before we move on that in some of the research I was looking into, the one of the messages from the beings in a hypnotherapy session was explaining that, and even some channelers have also said this, that we haven't fully, as a society, come to understand yet that everything is alive and has consciousness, that there isn't anything that isn't made up of this consciousness, and that when we start to understand that, it's gonna change our science. And this is why, like Representative Paula Luna, I know that somebody's telling her something that knows, because she was asking questions in one of the recent hearings that I think is very important, which the main populace might think weird, but she was asking about the craft being alive, which many abductees and insiders have reported that the craft are actually living entities themselves, which is very fascinating. But yeah, that was it.
Christian, that is such a good point, and I really appreciate that comment because it's true. The craft do come across as alive in a lot of these different kinds of sessions. In the New Jersey drone session I did, that whatever that intelligence was, it was like on the quantum level. It was so tiny, it was smaller than microscopic, and it was able to make this whole structure around itself that was also alive and sentient. And then I also just posted a session I did on the Calvine UFO, the famous picture that was snapped in the 1990s in Scotland of this huge diamond-shaped UFO and some kind of military jet tailing it that was taken by two people that were hiking. I did a session on that, and that ship was alive 100%. That ship had consciousness. It's kind of like the old Farscape show, if you've ever seen it, the ship in there, Moira. It's like that. It's just like that.
In my early 20s, it just out of nowhere, I had moved to Bisbee, Arizona, which is down near the southern edge of Arizona, about 20 minutes from the Mexican border, and it just rocks suddenly became this wild obsession. And I would hold them, and I could feel the ancientness of it, and I started referring to them as, like, it sounds so wild to a lot of people, like the rock people, and that they had like sentience. And I would sit down, try to meditate. I remember one time I had a quartz crystal vibrating in my hand, and quartz is one of those things too where we use it in our electronics, and it's shown we could put the history, our whole human history, in a crystal and have it saved there as data. And so they're definitely alive. There's everything, and we're all one. So air, earth, water, fire, human, dog, stardust. It's all alive. The universe is alive. And when you did this this session, sorry to keep going on about the New Jersey drone stuff, because it is what's in the news. And again, it's just fantastical to me. Like we talked about before we started recording, about how we could always have this picture in our mind about the way the appearance is going to start happening, but it's never what we would expect, what we could use in our wildest dreams. Now, some people out there would say, well, you're still dreaming, pal. There's nothing there. Look, there is no way, with everything going on, that there's nothing there. And so when you did your sessions, which we will link in the description, okay, and I highly suggest everyone watch these. It's just astounding. It still leaves me awestruck. And I know that the feeling that my fiance and I get when we have that contact is just, use a perfect term in a language that has no perfect terminology for the experience, as otherworldly, because her and I have said that before. What is the what was the sense when you finally made contact? Because it took a little while for you to really because there was the red swirl, kind of like I envisioned like a torus, because it's going in, or it's going in and it's going out, and there's replication and just renewal of these orbs. And then you dug deeper, and it was like there was this consciousness. What did it, I know this is probably a really impossible question to put into words, to quantify into words. What was the feeling that you had when there was that Adam and God finger touching Michelangelo moment there? I can't even imagine. And I've been hugged in a way that, by a non-human intelligence that I couldn't even see. And I know how that made me feel. I wept for 15 minutes out of joy as I felt every piece of anger, spite, fear just fall off of me like rusted armor, and I felt renewed. So I can imagine what this must have felt like, because I know that you mentioned that it was making you kind of uncomfortable because you had never experienced anything like this before, which just blew my mind. But anyway, how was that feeling, if you could describe it, Birdie?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. When you start a remote viewing session or a mapping session, as I call it, you're working around the edges of something and trying to figure out what's going on. And when I figured out there was something here that was non-human, and I started to explore it, it reached out to me. It reached out to me. It gave me a message. It told me something about itself. It like became part of me in that moment. And that was the part that was kind of unsettling, and not because it was scary, because it wasn't scary. This thing wasn't malevolent. I didn't get the sense that there was any ill intent here whatsoever. It I'm not sure I call it benevolent. It seemed kind of dispassionate. It seemed like it just was what it was. And it reached out and gave me this message. It told me who it was and what it was doing, but it was this weird compact message. I like to call these things thought balls when you get them from a non-human intelligence, because it's usually this packet of data. It's a whole thing at once, because whatever this intelligence was, it thought, I'm not even sure think or thought is the right word, but it relayed things in a non-linear way. Its sense of time was way different than ours. And so it gave me this encapsulated bit of information, and it was overwhelming, overwhelming. It made me feel so small and so, just tiny compared to it, and just unsettled because I didn't know how to unravel this information, and I did the best I could, but there's still so much there. It's still stuck in my noggin, that whole message, and I'm going to keep working on unraveling that thread, those pieces that are there. But it tried to tell me a story in a very nonlinear, very deeply layered way about what it was and what it was doing. It recognized me in some way, as another bit of consciousness out there. Not me personally. I don't think it cared about me personally whatsoever. I think it just recognized there was some bit of consciousness reaching out to it, and it was just fascinating. In retrospect, at the time, it was unsettling because it was so overwhelming, so much information, boom, so fast. And it can be hard to decode things like that.
And you mentioned that you had the information was given to you that it was very old, and kind of like I gathered, maybe I'm wrong, that it's been with us, or at least watching us for and observing us and learning from us for a very long time here, but that it was also distant, which makes me kind of think that there's 2 points of communication from different parts of the universe or our galaxy or wherever have you, that's going through this non-local consciousness at this nexus point, and then you're connecting to that nexus point that's sending out all of these orbs to try to gather information and all that stuff, and at the same time give us information of their presence and everything else. Is that far off as far as
No, I think that that's pretty spot on. I mean, I got the sense that wherever it originated from was super far away. But far away can mean all kinds of different things. It might mean another dimension or something, some other kind of construct that we don't even have language for yet. All I know is it wasn't from here and it was a place I couldn't access. So it felt far to me. But they're here now and they've been here for a long time. They were going into the water, out of the water, replicating, sharing information. It was a collective and they were cataloging everything, all of us cataloging everything. They were cataloging the people, the animals, buildings, rocks, trees. I mean, I got this sense of literally everything, whatever they were coming into contact with. It was like they were scooping up all this information and then sharing it when they would go into the water through that spiral thing I drew, which was like, it's not a physical spiral. It's some kind of portal or opening, or I don't even know what, I mean, a lot of this stuff, it's so outside of our own experience that we don't have the language to adequately understand or describe it. But they would go in, they would share this information, and then they would get like kind of like an upload or an upgrade where they would then take in the information. I think I said learn and relearn in the session because that felt like learning and relearning rather than like a technical upload and download. It was more like a learning and relearning, and they would replicate and then boom, they'd come back out and start again. And each time they would go in, the collective became more aware or more understanding or knew more or something like that. Is all this stuff, it's so hard to describe when it's not human. When it evaluated me and humanity in general, it didn't see us as individuals. It saw us as being a part of this planet. Like we were literally part of the planet. It saw the planet as a whole, saw us as being an integral part, much like grass or trees or mycelium or anything. We were just a part, and our part is broken. There's a broken connection. There's something wrong happening with our part on this planet. And it was trying to give me this information. It saw us as interconnected, the way that they are interconnected, even though we don't recognize ourselves as being interconnected. It saw us that way. And like part of this message was that connection is broken. You've broken the connection. You have to reset that connection. And it was like a cautionary tale that we're at this crossroads, that we're losing this essential connection to everything around us and trying to isolate ourselves outside of that connection. And that's not healthy or good or something like that. It was, it's hard to figure out what it was trying to say, but it was something like that.
Thank you.
Birdie also mentioned, I believe it was on video 3, where you're talking about the agencies that were tracking these objects and these UAPs to, drones, but you got a pretty good sense of some of what these agents were thinking. People that are officials, part of these programs, and they were pretty unnerved with the activity and everything. Was that correct? Can you go into a little bit more detail?
Yeah. So on the third part of the session, because I broke the session over 3 days and it wasn't revealed to me until the entire end. But on the third part, I focused in on what was going on with the military with regard to that, because I had gotten in the first couple parts of the session that there was something going on with the military. I kept getting a helicopter and drones that were more conventional, unmanned aircraft, I think I called them, something like that. And so I started focusing on that in the third part because I wanted to figure out what was going on there. And I got that the orders from the helicopter, there was a helicopter pilot that was there over the shores of New Jersey, monitoring what was happening. And he had gotten a message from these entities, from this non-human intelligence, whatever you want to call it. He had gotten a message. He was pretty freaked out by it. Young guy, they're all super young. They just feel like kids to me because I'm old. But he was super young and struggling with this, and he was getting what he felt he was in the middle between this non-human intelligence that had given him a message and his superiors, the powers that be, whatever you want to call them, his superiors, his military superiors. So then I focused on the military superiors to find out, okay, who are these people? What are they doing? And I ended up drawing like a 5-sided building. I said it had a hole in it, and that might be the Pentagon. The hole might refer to the hole that went in there at 9/11, or it could be just a metaphor for some big, military industrial complex building. In remote viewing, you often get things that are layered in metaphor, but it had layers underground. This building went way deep underground, which the Pentagon does. And I got a main guy, and I got him very strongly. And I described him, older guy, probably about my age, and somebody kind of high up on the military chain, but not like a full bird colonel, but more, maybe a general of some sort. And he was giving orders. He was the one giving the orders for what these other young men were doing out in the sky, monitoring the situation. And I liked him. Sometimes you look at different kinds of things and you don't like a person and you feel they have bad intentions. I didn't feel that at all whatsoever when I looked at this guy. I just felt this was a guy that's doing his job. He's confused. He doesn't know how to deal with this situation, but he felt like a nice person, had a good sense of humor, really interesting guy, smart. But he was barking out these orders. He told the helicopter pilot to engage. And by engage, I don't mean get the guns out. I think he wanted the helicopter pilot to disable the drones, the non-human intelligence things that were appearing as drones, but it didn't work. He also had another person who was working there with him. And this other guy was super interesting to me. He was younger, probably in his 30s, and a linguist, and very smart, highly educated, also military, and very, very, very religious. And he was trying to decode a message because they had gotten a message too. I kept getting this idea that there was a message that was being sent using some kind of frequency or sound or music. I'm not entirely sure. May not be an audible frequency. Maybe they picked something up, but they got a message they were trying to decode. And they were in a room where there were screens around and people sitting at these screens and looking along the screens, trying to figure this thing out. And the young guy was having a real crisis of faith because whatever was happening here, he was trying to make sense of it in terms of his religious upbringing and understanding, and really struggling with that. So that's what I got there.
I remember listening to it, just was really enthralled with all the details you were getting from those two individuals. You had also mentioned that they had these really advanced computers that we probably are not aware of tech-wise, to try to decode this. And then I remember in the session, you're like, they're trying to decode information. I can figure it out. And then you kind of went into deep diving, and it was potentially about what is to do with the sun, or you mentioned, and I love Battlestar Galactica, by the way, what has happened will happen again. Can you give a little bit more specifics on what that potentially is?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the coolest things about remote viewing is that even if something is super secret or intractable, you can go in and figure it out. So I went in to figure out the message. And there was this whole idea that whatever this non human intelligence was, it was hyper focused on the sun, like really focused on it. And so I drew the sun and I drew something coming out from the sun, maybe a solar flare, maybe a CME, coronal mass ejection. There was something going on with the sun that the non human intelligence was really looking at. And I felt a sense of concern. But there was also this idea that whatever was happening was cyclical. And that's when I threw in the Battlestar Galactica quote. It had happened in the past, it's going to happen again. And it had this sense, these beings had this sense that this was a cycle, a normal cycle. They're a part of it, we're a part of it, and there's some reset happening or recycling happening. There was a sense that things keep churning over and over and over. And it's just part of what is to them. It was part of what is. So, yeah, that was pretty interesting. The sun thing was really interesting. And I hope at some point to go back and look at this again. I hope someone gives it to me to look at again so that I can explore more about that connection.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
Just even listening to it, because we, of course, you mentioned earlier, 2017, and then we had the congressional hearing, and you got Grush up there talking about non-human intelligence, talking about interdimensionality, which we don't know whether this is or not, but still, you know major milestones. And then you have Danny Sheehan talking about the base off the coast that's making the UFOs. And then you start having like George Knapp, and he's got his show, and somebody does record a transmedium orb, right? And then everything's just culminating, and it does seem like it's put out there by some group of people or the NHI themselves to say, okay, this is actually happening. Because usually with ufology, usually with people that get into the disclosure, the little things will happen, and then something else that at least seems like it's not related will come back up, and then it'll die down for a while. It usually only has a shelf life of maybe a couple days, but this is now months upon months now, because again, not just US, like Lakenheath RAF bases, Germany, I think it was Ramstein base, and of course all the individual footage that's been found here and there that individuals have recorded, that most skeptics would say would be swamp gas or balloons. And it's just culminating. And I know I had a dream the other night, and I know I told these gentlemen that I couldn't really remember it, but the gist that I got was concern, and I think it was an inner concern that I may wake up tomorrow and then that'll go away. And I know that there's a lot of people like myself that have that worry or that concern, but this is kind of more just of a statement. And if you want to bounce off of it, feel free.
Yeah,
No, I don't think it's gonna stop.
I don't think it's going to stop. It hasn't stopped. It's been weeks now. And maybe the patterns will shift. Maybe we'll see them in other locations, but I don't think it's stopping. To me, what I got in the session and my own intuitive feeling on this is that this is the beginning of something new. And it's going to keep moving and shifting and growing. This is a kind of a way. I mean, if you think about it, if a non human intelligence is looking at humanity and thinking, how can we get them to realize that we're real when they're not being told that we're real? Well, one way to do it is to start acclimating humanity. So maybe you start mimicking the things in our sky that we're used to seeing.
Yes.
But yeah, and it's a way to kind of get people to move along the path, to get them to start understanding. And now, it's amazing because of the government's terrible response to all this ridiculous response. People are starting to question the government in ways I have never seen before.
Yes.
Usually most people just kind of listen and say, okay, and they go along and, of course they would. Why wouldn't they? Unless you're crazy, like, like us. but now people, regular people that haven't had an interest in this subject before are starting to think, wait a minute, what's going on? These aren't hobby drones. What the heck? What am I seeing above my house in New Jersey? What am I seeing above my high-rise apartment in New York City? What is this?
With all your experience, with everything you've seen, what would be some kind of ending thoughts that you would have just for viewers that are maybe first listening to this episode, for people that are having these experiences all over the world, potentially retroactively listening to this as things increase? What message would you have for them?
Yeah, I would say that the most important message is to look inside yourself and to be comfortable with who you are. If you look at all of our mystics going back through the beginnings of humanity, they all say the same thing over and over and over again, whether it's the Buddha or Jesus or some of the other mystics. They all say that right now is the most important moment. Be present in the now. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to your neighbors. And I think that that's the most important thing that we can do. We've lost a lot of our own agency, giving it up to technology, looking outside of ourselves for answers. But I think it's time now for us to start looking inside for answers. And I think that going forward, that's going to be the most important thing.
And Birdie, if people are wanting to find you, where can they find you or contact you?
They can find me at norivets.com, norivets.com.
We'll also put it up on the screen.
That's the name of your YouTube
And it's the name
channel
of
as
YouTube.
well.
That's right.
Well, I'll be sure to put both those up there along
Thank
with
you.
the websites. Yes.
Thank you.
And then links below. Well, thank you so much again, Birdie, for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for sharing all of your insight on the phenomenon, what's happening now, and will hopefully continue to happen. Please, everyone, go over to her website or her YouTube and subscribe and follow all of her stuff. Thank you, everyone, for chiming in and watching us at Cosmic Convergence. Please like, share, subscribe, and thank you all.
Bad monkey.